Hey guys and girl, I'm sure there's at least one of you out there on the internet watching my tutorials, I hope. But before I jump into the next Cinema 4D R14 tutorial, I really just want to say thank you guys for all the positive feedback from the last one I posted. It was really awesome to hear from everybody in such a positive way. So thanks. It's really cool to hear that my little bag of tricks are helping people out, and it's inspirational and it's humbling, and it just drives me to want to make more of these, and I hope I continue to deliver. So let's get on to the next one. Today I want to build an eyeball in Cinema 4D R14 Studio. We're going to use all procedural textures. That means I'm not going to use any scans. I'm not going to use any images downloaded off the internet. Everything that we're going to use is going to be created right inside of Cinema 4D with no third-party plugins. We're just going to use the material editor. And you don't even need to know how to draw. You don't have to have any illustration skills. This is going to be really cool tricks. So starting with looking up on Wikipedia to find the size of an eyeball, they say the average adult human eye is about 24 millimeters in diameter. So we work in radius here, so we cut that in half. We're going to go 12 millimeter. And when we hit enter, Cinema is going to convert it automatically for us to centimeters. And then I want to zoom in on that new shape, get that up on screen here. And I'm going to go into hidden line mode. What I want to do is I'm going to convert this primitive object at 24 segments low poly. I'm going to convert it to an object, so it's no longer going to be editable as a primitive. It's going to become polygons. But I'm going to go to my Polygon Tool, and I want to grab this top cap here and get rid of it. And that's going to be our opening. It's going to be our pupil. And the quickest way to do that, instead of grabbing the select tool and selecting each one by one, if I hit U on the keyboard, I get this menu. And loop selection is an option if I hit L. And you can see the cursor changes. I just click once and it selects everything in that loop, and I can hit delete on the keyboard, and just like that, that cap is gone. I'm going to make this ring the iris of the eyeball. So I'm going to grab the edge tool, and with the loop tool still selected, otherwise you hit U, L. I can grab that loop. Wrong one. I'll grab that. Then I grab my move tool, and then in the y-axis mode, I'm just going to drop that down, and I'm actually going to sink below, so it's like a scoop. It's not going to be flat across. It's going to be kind of scooped in, and that's going to be our iris. Now, if I hit render at this point, you can see that the Fong is actually smoothing out that edge, and we want that to be sharp. So grabbing the sphere, going to the Fong tag, changing that angle from 80 down to 30. If I hit render, now you'll see that edge is back. But because it's low poly here, I want to put this in a Hypernurb to smooth everything out, and that's going to end up smoothing this edge out again. So if I have my sphere selected, I hold down Option, Hypernurb, puts everything in a cage, but it smooths it out. So one more time, go to my edge tool, I go to U, L for loop, and I want to grab that edge. Now let's zoom in and turn on the interactive render region so you can see this cool trick. Interactive render. Now see how it's all smooth here? And a quick tip, if I hit Q, I can turn off the Hypernurb cage and then hit Q again, even if I don't have Hypernurb selected. I've got this top loop selected here. Hit Q to turn it on. M on the keyboard pulls up a different menu, and I want to hit R, and R is going to weight the Hypernurb. So if I grab that, see the cursor change there, and I pull that and see how it's pinching that there? As soon as I let go, I get my hard edge back. A little more detail in here. Zoom back, and now you can see we've got a Hypernurb smooth cage with a hard edge. So now we want to build the cornea, the little lens cap that goes on the top, and I'm just going to use a primitive sphere. I'm going to leave this one primitive. Comes in really big. I'm going to go 8 millimeters across. I'm going to leave the standard segments at 24. It's going to put it inside there. I want to drag this up. I'm going to turn off my snap and drag this up right till about where it intersects there. And I know that's about, I can't quite round that off to 0.5, but I can go just a little bit more and it's going to creep out a little bit past it. As long as I leave this button here, render perfect, checked, it's going to give me this perfectly smooth dome over here regardless of the low polygon. So we're going to leave that as a primitive. That becomes our lens for our cornea. So let's call this the cornea. Let's call this the eyeball. And with the cornea selected, I'm going to drag this material onto the cornea. Slide this over to the side, and we're going to open up our material editor big on the screen. And we're going to start doing some texturing. So my default materials are always gutted out because I'm never use it straight out of the box. I always tweak it. So I zeroed everything out. I've added that material to that cornea lens. So we're going to call that material cornea. And with transparent objects, I don't want this white here because it's going to make the lens look milky. So I'm going to turn that brightness all the way down to black. I could either set the color to black, but either way, I need the color box checked, or Cinema will calculate it different if there's no color in here. So I want at least black color. Second thing I want to do a better specular than the default built-in specular. So I'm going to use the luminance channel. And I'm going to come into effects and grab Lumis. And Lumis gives us this really cool speculars. You want to turn off the shader tab because that adds this weird color that's kind of unnecessary. We just want to use the highlight only and have everything else kind of disappear. And what you get is you get 3 speculars of varying opacities and sizes, and it feels much more natural. And if you're ever doing any metal thing, you can use the anisotropic setting, and you check this on, and you get this really cool like brushed metal, like for buttons or knobs or anything. It's really cool. But we don't want that, obviously, because we're doing specular for an eyeball. The next thing we want to do is transparency. Now, this gets a little tricky because when you turn transparency on, everything disappears completely. And in the standard renderer, the anti-aliasing through transparency looks really messy. So if I go into render settings, anti-aliasing, I can change this from geometry to best, and I can even bump up the samples a little bit. And you can try all these different settings and see which one works best for you. So that cleans up the anti-aliasing a little bit. Again, there is a clear sphere right here that we're not seeing right now because it is 100% transparent. You'll notice even our luminance, our little specular has disappeared when that's turned on. So what we can do is change our refraction. We want the light to bend as it goes through that lens, through that glass lens, and distort a little bit. So water refraction is 133. It's a little bit too extreme for what we're doing. We don't want the eye to distort the light that much. So we're just going to distort it about 102. Give us a nice little weird edge here so we could tell that something's happening when the camera moves around. I also want to turn on additive. And that kind of brings some light back into this lens. In addition to sliding this brightness value down, we can introduce some of that color from the color channel, and then once we have an environment, when we turn on reflection will also appear inside of this lens. So our reflection, we want our standard Fresnel fall off. And back to transparency, additive adds this really cool light distortion as it goes through. So that's pretty much all we have to do for the cornea. So the cornea is set. So let's create another texture. This texture is going to be for the eyeball. And I want to add that to the geometry. So let's drag that onto our eyeball down here. Now I don't want to see the texture on the inside, only on the outside. So I can select the sphere, go to the tag, and change the side from both to just the front. And now you can see that it's only doing the texture here and not on the inside. So this is where I'm going to get a little crazy in the color channel of the eyeball. I'm going to stack multiple layers of gradations on top of here to get this really cool effect. So you might want to start hovering over that pause button. I'm going to start by creating a layer, and then inside the layer, my base layer is going to be a gradient. And the gradient works from left to right, and it goes around. So I want to change the orientation. I want it to go from the bottom to top. So instead of 2D U, I want it to go in the V direction. So I'm going to change all of our gradients as I build them to 2D V from bottom to top. Another trick here is if you twirl the gradient open, you have more control over where these knots go. So you're not limited to just eyeballing it. You can actually punch in exact numbers. And I want exact numbers because I'm going to use my gradient not only to color the sclera, which is the white part of the eyeball, but I'm going to use that same gradation to follow through and wrap around onto my iris. And I'm going to use that all with these control nuts. So I can create colors in here. I can make a blue. And that's going to show up here. I want the base of my eyeball to be kind of a pinkish color. So I'm going to add a little bit of tone in here. So the base of the eyeball is going to be pink. It's going to transition to the edge. Let's just line these lines up right now. So if I slide these sliders around, get them kind of close, I know that I can make this 83% from the bottom to the very top of that UV map. 83% is that line where that iris is. So I can take the blue and start at 84, and I'll get a little bit. Actually, let's leave that at 83.5. That looked pretty good. Gets rid of that little white lip right there. So we're going to transition from the pink to this white color, but I don't want pure white. I'm going to want to add a little bit of a creamy color to it. So let's just knock some of the green and the blue out of this. And so it's not pure white right here. I also want to see a little bit more of the pink as it wraps around. So if I take this knot here and I slide it, I can choose which side of that gradation is heavier, whether I want the pink to be heavier toward the white or I want the white to be heavier toward the pink. So I'm going to choose to bring that up to around 70-75%. And that's going to really bring that color up around. Maybe let's drop it back to 70 so there's a little bit more white in here. I was just kind of guessing at that blue. Let's get a blue that's going to work under all of the lighting and everything that we do. Something that's not so cartoony, a little more organic. Something like that. So that's our first gradation. So the next thing we want to do, we kind of want to add those fibers and the membrane in here that when the iris expands and contracts to let more light in through the pupil, there's a bunch of little fibers and membrane here. We're going to simulate that with a shader, a surface shader. I'm actually going to use the water shader. Check out what happens here. This is really cool. The problem is it's going over the entire eyeball, and I just want it to be on the iris. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a layer mask, and that mask is just going to let this texture only show through at this part and mask out the rest. So we do that with a gradient. And create a gradient, put it on the V, and I'm going to move those knots. So I want to mask everything out. Everything that's in black will disappear, and everything that's white will show. So I'm going to take that knot, I'm going to move it to that 83. I'm going to take the other knot, the white, I'm going to make it 83.5 to match the other numbers where the blue was. And just like that, we have a mask. Okay? So I take that, I turn it into a layer mask, and I slide it underneath the water, what I want to mask. I want to mask that water, and just like that, it only lets that part show through. Now I want to change the scale of this. It's a little too extreme for this size of the eyeball. So I'm going to go into the water channel. Now, here's something you need to know about the water is it is automatically animated. So by default, if you are putting this eye in a scene and you're moving the camera around, your iris is going to animate, and you don't want that to happen. So you want to make sure you turn the frequency off. And I turn the wind off too. Now, the scale is too large, so we want to change the frequency. We want more striations in there. So I'm going to bump that number up to 10. But it's too stretched now, so I want the vertical frequency to be a little bit larger. So now we've got this really cool organic pattern that's happening in here. But what's happening is it's set to normal. So you're just seeing the black and white pattern that's going on. So we want to change the blending mode of this to let that blue show through. So if we come back over here and we change it from normal to luminance, it's going to let the color underneath show through, but it's going to use the dark and the light value. But it's too strong at 100, so I'm going to drop it down to 50%. So it's a little bit more subtle. Now we've got this cool looking iris happening here, but it's a little too perfect. So in the real world, there's a little more organic coloring happening. So let's add some color flecks to this eye to make it look a little more realistic. I'm going to create another shader. I'm going to create another gradient. And again, I'm going to put it in the V mode. And this time I'm going to go from black to, I'm going to make it a rusty brown color. And in case you're wondering, I wrote all these numbers down from my practice, so I'm not guessing on your dime. Because these tutorials are long enough as they are, so let's try and speed through them as fast as we can. So here's a little brown color, and now I want to mask this as well. So I'm going to create another gradient, put it in V mode, and then I want to slide this up to the 83, where we started the edge. But this time, instead of pinching the white down, I want this fall off to be part of the ramp where the brown is going to bleed into the blue. But this is a little too perfect. So over here, we've got this turbulence. And we can change this number, and it'll add this little noise pattern in here, which is really cool. And if you change the scale on it, it's going to make it a little bit more crunchy. See if we can move this up a little bit. Get that to creep in, maybe 84. Now we're going to use this as a mask for that brown that we just made. So we change it from normal to layer mask. And we slide it under the brown. And now you see the brown is blending with the blue. What I do want to do, I want to move the brown under that that fiber material that we made. So it's also going to be affected by the lights and the darks. So it gives it a little bit more variation as well. So the brown isn't going over the white and black. The white and black is going over the brown now. Now the next step is, at this point, I want to add a little bit of a cheat. I want to add a fake rim light on here. And I'm going to do that with a Fresnel layer. And Fresnel works the same way as it does as a mask when you're using it to hide your reflection and let your reflection show more on the edges. We could do the same in a color channel or a luminance channel with light. So it doesn't have to just be used as a mask to block transparency or reflection. It can also be used as a texture itself, and that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to soften the transition just by sliding the knot all the way to the white. And then I'm going to bring the black point, I'm going to kind of condense the space that it falls off here. And I can just put that perfectly in the middle at 50. Come back out, set it from normal to add. And now we've got a little bit of a hint of a rim light here. And this is driven, the Fresnel is driven by light in the scene. So if I were to put a light behind here, you would see that Fresnel light up on this side. Now for the fun part. We're going to add blood vessels in here. So we can do that by using the same water shader that we used for the iris under surface water. And remember, you want to turn off the animation. So set your frequencies to 0. And for the size of this, I'm going to go around 2 and 1. But I want to reverse the knots because I'm going to use this as a mask. So I'm going to turn black to white and white to black. I want to crunch this all the way over to the side. So I'm going to turn this up. I'm going to make that black 95. And that's going to force the contrast of that wave pattern to resemble these blood vessels like this. And we're going to use this as a mask to reveal the red as it comes through. So let's create that red now. Another gradient in the V. And the black end, I want solid red. But I want to change its position. I want to move this all the way up to around 70. And I'm going to get rid of that knot in the middle. I just want this to be a linear transition from red to white. I also want to bring my white down. I'm going to pinch this to that edge, that 83.5, so that red doesn't spill into my iris at all. Actually, I think if we have this smooth knot on, it's actually a smoother transition. Let's leave that smooth knot on there. So what happens at this point is if we turn the water layer underneath, the veins, if we turn that into a layer mask, it disappears until the layer above gets masked by it. And now it's going to mask those veins. But what it's doing is it's revealing the red to white gradation as it goes through. And now that those veins are showing the white onto our iris. Now, instead of having to do another mask to get rid of that, the quick solution, because we ramped it at the edge of the iris, we could just change it to multiply, and white disappears on multiply blend mode, and that solves our problem without having to do extra masking. Now, these veins are a little too intense, so we're going to take the opacity of that layer down to around 40%, and now we've got our big blood vessels in here. So to add further realism, we want to have a set of smaller blood vessels in here. So we're just going to duplicate the process of what we just did. So we're going to create another surface water. We're going to make sure that it's not animated. And we're going to change the frequency a lot tighter. So we're going to go 8, and then we're going to change the vertical stretch on that to 4. So we get a much tighter pattern. Again, we want to invert the knots. And we're going to crunch this up again to 95. Then we're going to hop out of here. Create another gradient in V. We're going to make our back end red. And we're going to slide this one up to 75. The other one was 70. We're going to make this one push a little bit deeper in there. And we're going to bring this down to 83. And then this time, instead of having this very uniform band around here, I'm going to add that turbulence into this edge of about 10. And that's just going to break up that edge a little bit. So now when we turn that tighter water pattern into a layer mask and turn this gradient on, remember the white's showing through, we got to change this from normal to multiply. The white disappears here. And far too intense, let's take this down to like 25%. So now we have our large blood vessels and our tiny blood vessels. And it's looking pretty cool. I like cool. So much like we did with the cornea with the lumis, with our specular, we're going to do the same thing here with our eyeball. So let's go, we're done with our layer stack here. Let's go to the luminance channel, activate it, come under effects, lumis, come into the lumis, and we want to turn off the shader tab here. And we'll get our same specular that we had on the cornea. We don't need transparency for the eyeball, but we do want reflection. Currently, we have nothing to reflect into the eyeball, so let's create an environment right now. So let's close our material editor. Let's turn off our interactive render region. And under our environment tab, let's create a floor. And the floor comes in at 0, 0, so we want to drop it. And let's take it below the eyeball, which is about 1.2 negative. And that's going to give us a floor that the eyeball is going to rest on. And now there's something to reflect into the eyeball as well. But let's also create something to bring light into the scene. And we do that under the Environment tab with a sky dome. So this puts a big invisible dome over the project. And off in the horizon, if I were to hit render right now, you'll see this big gray dome. And that's going to cast a solid color of gray into the shot, and it can be used with global illumination. If I turn that on right now, go under Effect, Global Illumination, and change this to IR and QMC, and I'm going to change this up to high. Now if I hit render, that gray dome is casting light into the scene, and now you can see that Fresnel that I added on there is showing up. In addition to adding light, it can also add a material to reflect, but since it's a solid gray color, that's kind of boring. So if we create a new material, turn off the color and go into luminance, and under surfaces, I can create a checkerboard. I can drag that checkerboard onto the sky. Now the sky is projecting a checkerboard back into the scene. Not only for light, it's using black and white squares for light, it's also going to project that as a reflection map. But picture a dome with just one checkerboard on it with 4 squares. It's a little too daunting, so I'm going to double the tiles and just add 2 and 2, and now we've got more checkers in our background back there. But I don't want to see the checkerboard anyway, so on our sky, we're going to go under Cinema 4D tags, compositing, and we're going to tell Cinema to ignore that sky dome. So we're going to turn off Scene by Camera. So visually it's gone, but all of the other aspects are still calculated. It's still going to use reflections and lighting and global illumination and everything. So now if I hit render, you don't see the checkerboard in the back, but you still see the lighting. And you see the reflection in the cornea here, because remember we added reflection to that surface. As this draws in, you'll see the reflection of the checkerboard in the cornea. So let's add the reflection onto the eyeball itself now. So let's go back into the eyeball. Let's go to our reflection tab. So by default, when you turn on reflection, it just makes everything a giant mirror ball. And we need to dial that back. So the standard thing we always want to do is right off the bat, we want to add a Fresnel. And that Fresnel is going to block out the reflection as the object faces the camera, and as the light bends around the edge, it's going to pick up more reflection. What I also want to do, though, I'm going to add a mask to it because I don't want that reflection to be on the iris itself, or I want to knock back the reflection on the iris. And if I were to do that with a mask, I risk some of the brightness of this reflection showing through. So I want to turn all the brightness down 100%, so there's no reflection on here at all. But then if I add a Fresnel, it brings that reflection back as it creeps around the edge. However, I want to limit the reflection on the iris. So let's spin the camera around where we can see better. So we've got double reflection going on. We've got reflection on the cornea, and we've also got reflection on the iris. So I'm going to use a mask to knock this back. So I'm going to turn our Fresnel into a layer. Come in here. Create a gradient, put the gradient on the V, and I want to invert the knobs. So I want all of this to show the Fresnel through the mask. So I'm going to put that at our 83. And then our black, actually I don't want it to be black, 100% black, because I don't want it to block it out completely. I want it to let some of it show through. So I'm going to change that to a value of 40, and then I'm going to put that at the 83.5 point. So now what that's doing is it's letting the reflection show 100% all the way up to the iris, and then only 40% shows through at that point. Right now, it's just the gradation that's allowing the reflection. We want to use the gradation as a mask to the Fresnel. So we're going to put the gradient under the Fresnel, and then we're going to turn it into a layer mask. So now we have our Fresnel and part of it showing through onto the iris. It's a little complicated, so feel free to rewind and follow it step by step until it makes sense. feeling like our Fresnel isn't working on the cornea. Let me go look at that real quick. Reflection. Yeah, we have got Fresnel on there. So back to our eyeball reflection. I wanted to change this mix strength down to about 95 so it's not full on reflective 100% at the edge here. I would also like to add a light into the scene, and I can add caustics to that light as well. This would be a cool effect. Let's turn off the interactive render region. Let's close our material editor, and let's zoom out so you can see when I bring a light in here. I'm going to use an area light, and it comes in really, really large. So I'm going to go under details. I want to change that down small to our size of our scene. So I'm going to put 5 centimeters in there and zoom back in. And I want to offset this. I'm going to go to coordinates, and I'm going to push this 20 centimeters up into the back. And let's pan around so you can see what I'm doing here. I also want to angle the light so it's pointing at the eyeball. So I'm going to change the rotation of that light so it's kind of angling this way. Also want to add a shadow to the light, because by default lights don't have shadows turned on. So we're going to turn on an area shadow. So now if I hit render, it's going to calculate our global illumination, our light, and it casts this really cool shadow here. I want a little more realistic fall off from this light. So built into Cinema, under details, there is a fall off. And you can change this to physically accurate inverse square. But by default, it's set to 500 centimeters, which is much too big for our scene. So it's like the light is right up on top of our object when it's that bright. So I want to scale this down to 25 centimeters. This is more accurate to the scale of our little universe that we're playing in here. And then you can see the light kind of falls off around the edge. So the other thing I want to do with the light is I want to turn on the caustics. Now caustics work with reflective materials that a light will bounce off that material, and then that light will then in turn bounce back onto the surface around it. Or it'll pass through glass, and if you've ever held a water glass up to sunlight and you've seen the water dancing, that's a caustic. And we can simulate that here with this light. However, you also need to add caustics to the scene in order for that to work. So we come under your effects, you add caustics. We'll just leave the default settings here. Come back to the view, and interactive render region is always a good way to test to see if something's working. And it is, but it's too bright. See how powerful that is. So caustics also has a fall off. So we want to do the inverse square of the caustic fall off and drop this from the 1,000 centimeters, which is far too big for the scene. We'll drop it down to 50. And now we have a little bit of a bounce light. It's subtle. I'll turn it off. But it adds a little bit of magic to the scene. You know, let's bump up the photons from 10,000 to 100,000. And that'll give us more. There you see the light spilling off right there. That's pretty cool. Let me zoom in on that so you can see it. That light is bouncing off back onto the floor here, and it has a really cool effect. We also are losing, because of the global illumination and the caustics, we're losing our contact shadow. And we can bring part of that back with ambient occlusion. But what I really want to use ambient occlusion for is here on the eyeball itself, where the cornea connects to the iris. That is called the limbal ring, or the corneal limbus. And that's the dark ring that you usually see when you look at photographs of an eyeball. So we can simulate that with ambient occlusion. So let's come into our render settings again, and one more time under effect, we're going to add ambient occlusion. And at again, a scale of our project, we need to drop this way down. From 100 centimeters, I'm going to drop it all the way down to just a half a centimeter. And I'm also going to cheat. I'm going to pinch the fall off. So this way I can cheat and get a little bit more of the black ring right where those two surfaces come together. I can force a little bit more black in there. And I'm going to pinch the white as well, so the fall off happens a little bit quicker. So now when we come back here, watch what happens in the iris. It's pretty cool. As this draws in, we now have a little bit of a contact shadow on that edge, and it just really helps the realism of the piece. So there you have it. There's an eyeball. You can do some crazy tricks if you want. I tried to run the displacement filter on this and get the blood vessels to kind of pop out a little bit. It's a really great trick. It just takes too much time for the tutorial, so I can let you guys experiment on your own with that. Another thing you can do is probably write an espresso script where you can grab these selection of these rings, and you can maybe build a slider to expand and contract the pupil if you wanted to. Let's just take a quick look at that. If I come under my eyeball, let's hide the cornea for right now, and UL for loop mode, and I grab this, and then I can just transform and squeeze this. If you write an espresso, you can dilate the pupil. That'd be pretty cool. And let's just send this off with a final render while we're talking our way out of this thing here. Another little quick thing we could do, we could drop all these into a null and then copy and paste that. And then rotate. And render away. I know most of us are always scrambling to try and find real source photography and pulling our hair out, so it's always nice to learn how to do these little tricks and get most of the way there without having to use any scan photography at all, if you can get away with it. And you can see this holds up pretty well at a close detail, so imagine if this were further back in screen and it wasn't as close up. It'd be pretty cool. Again, the checkerboard reflection was just something to reflect into there. You can use any HDRI image you want. You don't have to just use the checkerboard. So thank you guys again for sitting through another tutorial. I hope there was something in here that helps you on a future project and speed up your workflow. Because remember, sometimes it's not about being perfect, it's about hitting your deadline. If you guys have any suggestions of how this could have been done faster or quicker or differently, drop a line. I always love hearing from you. I'm always learning as well as teaching, and we'll roll all the knowledge into the future tutorials and share with everybody. So I'll see you guys on the next tutorial. Bye.